welcome to another Agile Uprising podcast. I'm Andy Cleff. I'm really excited and pleased and happy to have my friend and fellow troublemaker back on the show. We have a tradition here of garbling last names, and today will be no exception on the podcast. Jay, you started this. I'm carrying on the tradition. Simon Applewoods. No, sorry, that's the English translation. Simon Holzapfel. Holzapfel. You know, the origin of our names that could be a show in itself.
It could.
But welcome back.
Thanks.
We chatted, oh my God, it was years ago. I had to look because my time calendar brain is not reliable. Back in 2022, there was a lot of stuff going in the world of education, post-COVID trauma, teachers resigning, and we had a couple of shows about Agile in education, and we're going to leverage some of that experience of yours today as we explore something that's equally relevant and, to me, really provocative. You proposed this a couple of weeks back by sharing some stuff that we'll dive into, and the kernel is modern, in quotes, modern management theories are really based on false assumptions. And we've been practicing them for centuries, and there's collateral damage that we're seeing in bits and pieces. And because of this complex system we're in, we don't see it all, but we feel it and we respond to it.
Yeah.
So maybe that's for our listeners, not what if common management theories are wrong, but duh, what do we do about it? So maybe with any luck, our conversation today will shed some light on better ideas about organizations, teamwork, things that will catalyze rather than fight against our human nature, whatever that actually is. Let me share a little bit about you, Simon. It's funny talking about you in the third person when I'm looking at you, but our listeners don't have the benefit of the image. They can look on the podcast cover and see your beautiful smiling face. As I mentioned, you're an educator. You're also a coach of young and old and new and experienced, and you innovate in a way that brings research from multiple disciplines that aren't just theoretical, but have practical application. You are practicing in education and in business, so this is not theory. And one of the things that I love is how you bring these insights, which we'll touch into, from ancient human society and modern neuroscience, and help weave together what really drives us in our collaboration and learning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Before we get too deep in all of that stuff, I always like to have a warm-up question.
Okay.
What's something you discovered recently that completely surprised you?
Oh man. Well, recently is always hard for me to fix. But I would say one of the things that I've really been not completely surprised about, but very surprised about is as time rolls forward post-pandemic, more and more people in the world of education, more and more people in the world of, organizational improvement and guidance are converging around certain ideas that in the past have been, I think, more fringe and are now moving towards the center as many more organizations develop a more people-centric notion of how they're going to be successful. And if you had asked me that 20 years ago, I would have been, completely surprised that it's just, and I guess I'm surprised that the cruft and that these sort of more antiquated ways of not working, because things often don't work in those ways, are really up for grabs. And so what I really want to do in the time with you today is just propose some ideas that the timeline of agility is far longer than we thought. And so I'm not talking about agile in terms of frameworks, talking about sort of those most basic patterns of human collaboration interaction over time, and some specific historical examples that we know about that indicate that agility is not a new thing. In fact, it might be the most ancient thing about how humans have built civilizations, et cetera, across time and sustained them.
Wow. Let's see if we can weave that all in the next hour or 40 minutes.
Cool. We'll find out. We'll see where it goes.
So three themes that we'll try to cover. Historical evidence gives us some powerful insights into patterns of human organization over eons.
Yeah.
We'll talk about biological foundations, tapping into some modern neuroscience, which gives us insight into these, what you and I joked about before the show, these salty water bags that contain 10 trillion other salty water bags that are part of 8 billion other salty water bags on this just brilliant blue salty water rock.
Yeah.
And then enough on, theory, can we bring it together? Can we weave it together as you described some of these, which to some people might be fringe, might be blah, 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 crazy stuff.
Yeah.
What are the implications for tomorrow, next week, next year, 10 years? You and I share a desire, a passion for rehumanizing the world of work.
100%.
No shortage of evidence that what we got today in many places is far from conducive to being human in the workplace.
Yeah.
It can be resources.
I mean, if humans are meant to be connected and 2/3 of us are disengaged at work, that's a pretty clear indicator that we could improve a lot.
All right, theme number one, the
Yep.
historical evidence. Before the show, what got this started, you shared with me some really cool anthropological insights that point to how humans over the eons have organized and learned and lived together. And specifically, and I'll put links in the show notes, you showed me a site plan of a prehistoric mega site, 6,000 years old, 4,000 BC, if you like to use that calendar, that demonstrated something like 10,000 people
Yep.
organized without hierarchical control structures, right? Without Jira, without agile release trains, without all this other stuff. Tell us more about that site. And here's my next chance to garble pronunciation. Nebalivka?
Exactly. Yep. Nebelivka.
What led you to that? How'd you come across this site on the Ukrainian forest steppes from 4000 BC?
Yeah, for sure. So David Graeber and David Wengrow wrote a book called The Dawn of Everything. And these guys are, archaeologists and anthropologists. And what they're looking for are there pieces of evidence that might revise that old notion that we have that, the pre-moderns' lives were short, dark, and brutish, or whatever it was, whatever that formulation was, to suggest that people at really significant scale, and we know that scale matters as much then as it does now in terms of network development. So that scale doesn't require what often we think is required to achieve scale. So if you were to go look at these pictures, you would see a city or so, a few miles across, ringed on the outside, and essentially open on the inside. In other words, lots of little small houses, neighborhoods, and sort of neighborhood lodges. But what this suggests is 10,000 people used a very decentralized way of working. And what they didn't find specifically that tend to be found in more modern sites were no huge sites of religious practice, no huge sites of civil administration, no prisons, that sort of stuff. So it's not to say that everyone was just like mellow and, getting along all the time, but rather they clearly had 10,000 people 6,000 years ago doing things that didn't seem to require the sort of centralization that we think. And I would just recommend the book highly because it really challenges some of our assumptions about organizational design and what is required. Simply saying you can move towards more decentralized ways of working. And this, like you said, this is pre-Jira, this is pre-email, this is ancient, right? This is like Egyptian times. And yet what we see is evidence of very, very much flatter ways of living and orchestrating humanity at scale.
I'll put a link to that book, The Dawn of Everything, in
Yeah.
the show notes. I also know you've explored other indigenous, quote,
Yep.
a hunter-gatherer. I don't want to call them primitive because that's
No.
a fallacy. How have what you've learned in that exploration also challenged other assumptions about our human nature and how we organize?
For sure. So if we look at what was the political theory of some of our founding documents, especially the Declaration of Independence, what we see is very clear reference to First Nations, North American First Nations peoples as providing some of the ideas about liberty, individual liberty in particular, that was adopted and brought over to Europe in the 18th century and was then brought into Lockean and other more sort of well-known ideas about governance. So the Haudenosaunee, and I'm probably missing the pronunciation of that a bit, Haudenosaunee were the First Nations of what now is upstate New York. They too were able to organize significant forms of confederacy across very long periods of time. I'm not saying that everyone got to get, it was like all peace and love. Clearly it wasn't, but it was very different from our basic assumptions about how things need to be. And if you've ever worked in a company where you hear that's just how we've always done it, and it's that same sort of sclerosis back to an unquestioned beginning that I'm proposing. If we can begin to interrogate and interpret more broadly, we can find space and make space for more humanism in our schools, in our organizations, etc.
Yeah, that's status quo.
Yeah.
Organizational debt. That's, the time cycle to change is a lot longer than my next incentive bonus, so I ain't touching that. Which brings me to, a certain understanding of these societies and how they viewed themselves and the language they had, that they were not separate from the ecosystem they lived in. There's probably, fewer words for man and nature. There was just one.
Yep.
Particularly, there was something, Sand Talk was another wonderful book about indigenous culture. And it's just like, there is no you and me. There's us. There's us too.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? I am not separate from you. And if we get into the science of how we exist, where is the edge of me and the beginning of you? That's a whole nother show. But somewhere along the line, and there's another good book, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, where we shifted our collective mindset, and the status quo became nature, resources, they're for exploitation and profit, and it began parts and wholes and separated them,
Yep.
and it polarized things.
Yep. Yep.
We see that today.
We do. We do. And even in some of our earliest science with Linnaeus and other people who are trying to categorize the natural world, they could have pulled from a tradition that is more all these things matter and we don't need to establish top and bottom, better and worst, advanced, not advanced. But they brought in this notion of specifically hierarchy among differences as opposed to seeing differences as useful and not as something where, and this is where if you look at like phrenology in the 19th century, they were just, obsessed with these measurements of this, that, and the other thing. A lot of the 19th century phrenology stuff then led into eugenics and all these really nasty sort of hierarchy-based ways to look at variability across populations. That still obviously haunts huge parts of the world periodically in genocide and these sorts of things now. But we're really non-necessary inventions, and we understand this from looking both at lots of faith traditions, especially the more non-dual faith traditions that saw the big we as the basic unit of inquiry, as opposed to the little me as the only way to measure things and understand progress or development.
It's so convenient to have those little boxes on the org
Yeah.
chart,
Yeah.
because then we can group the boxes and measure them and incentivize the behavior we want out of this so-called organizational machine.
Yep.
And instead of the harder viewpoint of these are living systems
Right.
that have a mutual learning context that we can't see at all.
Yeah.
What are some of the lasting impacts of this colonialism, industrial era thinking that you've seen as you work with individuals and classrooms and schools and organizations?
I think the thing that really comes out again and again is how much people are biologically made to need and continue, even in the world of screens, to need connection. This sort of ultra atomized view. Colonial is a fine way to say it, but I think that to some degree, it's it's not simply colonial. It really is a more fundamental ordering around hierarchy and better and worse, and a sort of exclusiveness because the industrial mind was a fundamentally mechanistic zero-sum sort of mind. And the digital age has allowed us to have sort of more organic, network-based, sort of generative human patterns of interaction, collaboration, etc.
Let me play devil's advocate.
Mm,
In the modern organization,
yep.
whatever that means to our listener, we're trying to have connections and networks and communication. Yet, based on what I sense, and again, um, I'm subject to my bias, it doesn't work. You know, there's stress, there's burnout, and there's increase in anxiety and depression and blah, blah, blah. Were they not present? How could we know if they weren't present back in, you know, uh, the earlier evolution of human, quote, connection and networks? I don't know.
That's super interesting. I gotta say, I don't really know, but I certainly wonder about those sort of things. And what we definitely, much less speculatively, is just the trail of burnout in both schools and in, corporate America. Fundamental health issues, stress, anxiety, depression, silent resignation, withdrawal, all these things are signs of, if we look at our just connectiveness to the world and how much we feel connected in as something that's either sort of growing like you would imagine a snowflake grows or shrinking and melting, we're not in a great way. And the lasting impacts of these industrial ideas can be seen in all these phenomena, in nervous systems that are just perpetually out of whack, leading to all sorts of non-optimal outcomes at the level of individual, but also at the level of team decision making, also at the level of portfolio decision making, also at the level of, all these other things, right from governance layers at the quote unquote top of an organization down. And so we're seeing this wreckage of people and lost human potential in schools and outside. That's really sad. And on the one hand, as much as it's sad, it makes me feel excited because we have so much room that we can grow. And that is profoundly exciting.
And we have access to networks and technology that I'm not sure we're making the best use of because maybe we
Totally.
don't fully understand
Yeah.
uh, our biological foundations in nature to take advantage of it. Like, 100 years ago, my network would have been my nuclear family and people I could get to within a day's travel. And now I can be connected instantaneously to individuals and groups of individuals anywhere on the freaking planet and in orbit. If we want to extend a little bit up
Yeah.
and consider the larger water bag that is Earth,
Hmm.
yet for some reason is not as fulfilling. Let's look into some of these biological foundations.
Sure.
Maybe they'll give us some insights. Right. So you
Sure.
brought these historical patterns
Mhm.
that show something about our inherent capability, our natures, and some of the other research you shared show these connections between our biological systems, our ability to learn, explore, and thrive. Let's explore those in
Mm.
the context of our responses to events of change and stress, which are more frequent in my world. And again, it's biased by what I watch in my social bubble and all that stuff. But there is more frequent change and more frequent stress just in my world. Let's start with the individual.
Sure.
What's talk about me for a minute, right? And my ability to adapt based on whatever I allow to be my immediate environment.
Sure. So let's in doing that take one step back just into the world of kind of lowercase a agility and recognize that agility is our original nature. And that's my sort of hypothesis. And I'd say that just in the basic fact of what we know about where our bodies come from, how they evolve, and what are some of the essential features of a human fetus becoming an adult person. And the vocab word there is pluripotency. So every stem cell has what's called pluripotency, which means every stem cell has the ability to sense and respond to what's in the environment before being triggered to become one of the any kind of cells that's needed for the body at that moment in time.
Got it.
So it's an environmental trigger that meets our pluripotent agility, right? Our ability to become more T-shaped person of whatever it is, our ability to not just do the one thing, but do multiple things, that pluripotent concept. And there are ways to kind of encourage that within the human nervous system, but certainly also within teams and other more standard organizational structures.
So my individual cells, my network of systems that run me
Hmm.
and my brain, my mind. So you're suggesting I am built for adaptability.
100%. There's just no doubt. We couldn't we wouldn't be having this conversation with this technology if people couldn't do exactly the things that we're talking about. We wouldn't be here. I mean, we as a species came through a bottleneck about 15,000 years ago. There was about a million or so of us total on our big bag, on our big salt bag. A million people. We came through that bottleneck. So we have a vast amount of shared, you know, ancestry and all these things. And, given that our physical form has been largely unchanged for 200,000 years, and, I think it would be naive to assume nothing was going on across all but the last couple of hundred years of, the human project.
You shared another concept that I want to dive into about our natural adaptability, and it's this heart rate variability
Yeah,
that tells us something about our capacity to learn as well
sure.
as adapt to stress. And I'm aware of it only through my recent update to my smartwatch, but I have no idea the implications or how to understand it. Tell us more about HRV,
Sure.
what it tells us about our capacity to learn as well as
Yep.
to adapt to stress.
Yep. And so the first counterintuitive thing is the greater the variability, the stronger our health. So I'll just explain. So in the course of, if you're an audience member, if you're listening right now and you take a long, slow, big, deep breath, and then a big, equally large out breath, if you can just listen to your pulse in your ear, you'll notice that your pulse rate changes. And as you inhale, the pulse comes up. And as you begin exhaling, the pulse actually slows down. So that is the variability across a full breath cycle. And when your body is healthy, the variability is bigger. The mechanistic world says, oh no, you're healthy when your pulse is is just like always the same. No, that's the sign of a stressed out person. Low heart rate variability is the sign of a stressed nervous system.
So that's counterintuitive to me.
Yes, me too. When I found it, I was like, whoa, okay, interesting. And that was again where there's this sort of other intelligence, these other metrics that are not about standard predictability, sort of the Linnaean linear mind, but rather it's in the variability of the pulse across a full breath that you find indicators of health.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so my response to stress, my the yesterday me thought my response to stress was to calm my heart rate down.
Mm.
And that sounds incorrect.
Well, not necessarily because settling oneself is a thing. I think without knowing more about that moment, those things may be certainly related, but yeah, like when you get like a fright because suddenly, your eggs fall out of your shopping bag and you see them like slow motion going for the floor and you're like, oh, that sort of thing. That's just like a quick startle scare response. And your pulse spikes, but this is HRV is a different thing.
Got it.
But if you want to talk about sort of what I mean, we can get into that a little bit more so that people can understand things they can do to improve their HRV.
Yeah, let's talk about that and then bridge it from the individual to the collective.
Sure.
Our goal is not to operate as individual me's, but us.
Right. Wheeze. Wheeze
We's.
over me's. And the simple thing is you just got to take the M and flip it upside down to make it become a W.
Oh, it's so easy. That's it. Okay. Show
Yep.
over.
Yep. So let me just talk a little bit about our kind of basic wiring. And our basic wiring has been part of our body plan for a very, very long time. If we look at the body plans all the way back through certainly all the mammals and even further back, We know that they have two basic nervous systems going on. One nervous system sort of governs the get up and go, move, fight or flight stuff. That is the sympathetic nervous system, the activator, the mover. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest and reflect sort of thing, the thing that you have to do if you want to actually grow. After something stressful happens, you rest, then you get better. So you have these sympathetic, parasympathetic, and they basically, we work best. We are most pluripotent. We're most able to engage and be with the world and others when those things are more balanced than less balanced. In a world of 24/7 news and all these sort of things, our sympathetic fight or flight system just gets jacked up. And so oftentimes people might have time to relax, but they can't because their sympathetic system has been so on. And the vagus nervous system, the vagus nerve, which runs down kind of the front of our body and is critical to the parasympathetic nervous system, is something that just like a dog or a cat or a bird, when you see them periodically shake to kind of reset, we can do that. I do that. There's lots of internet videos of people doing that. And more recently, I've started to partner with local schools to bring a routine of balancing those nervous systems into the elementary schools.
Tell us more about that.
Sure. So basically, I partnered with the phys ed teacher, the school nurse, and the school counselor. So we're kind of a four-person team. And what we're doing is designing for the faculty ways for students to both reset themselves as they sense the need to do that, or perhaps at teacher's direction, so that once they learn how to balance their nervous systems, then they have that, stability of mind, that equanimity, that ability to stay focused, be with people, get out of that fight or flight mode, which usually is not about we-ness, but is more about me surviving. And yeah, that's what we're doing in school, so that young people can be given the tools in a sort of non and minimally strange way with trusted adults to learn to reboot their own nervous system imbalances, thereby making them better able to learn and blah, blah, blah. And we're in the process of bringing some bit of tech into the classroom to let students opt into anonymously measuring their HRV because it's obviously a school and they're minors. So we have to build the things that have no traceability because of HIPAA and all this sort of stuff. But interested in seeing, showing the world that there are interventions to help us do better. They require some coordination, but the upside is gigantic.
Interventions, in a sense, at the individual and the small collective. I'm reminded of, I don't know the date, Google's Project Aristotle, where psychological safety came up, and then suddenly there was, let's put in, meditation pods, and then recently, the big consultancies pushed chief well-being officers. But to me, that feels like a bit of malarkey because we're all swimming in a caustic tidal pool. And those collective responses, they're great for a little while,
Yep.
but at the long term, we get what we're seeing: burnout and stress and quiet resignation.
And I think often that's because those things are imposed top down in companies. They're not often involving the frontline people. And if your manager doesn't know how to support that level, that thing coming from above, it may or may not get to you and your team at all. The things that I'm doing with teams and organizations, especially for remote teams, lets everyone, as I could do, just hop off my seat here, do a 2-minute routine on the floor behind my chair on my rug, and come back way balanced, really ready to, carry on the day with other people, listen better, just be more in that balanced stance instead of a frenetic stance towards my work, towards my colleagues, towards yeah.
Enhancing your ability to deal with whatever system you're in.
Right. Combine that with the visible work, and people shouldn't walk around with knots in their stomach and knots in their intestines and all that sort of stuff. Because when you get visible work and you start to build those ways to sort of decompress and rebalance together, that's the, team cohesion that any long-term sustainable organization or culture relies on if it's going to actually get to that future.
Let's look at that systems view a little bit more, and then we'll segue into, okay, what do we do about it? So with this biological understanding of our natural adaptability, our ability to be resilient in the face of adversity.
Mm,
What are some of the conditions that we need to enable at the organizational level to make this sustainable?
yeah. Trust, obviously, and some sort of collective or shared vision.
Yeah.
At least in the schools and organizations that I work in, which are smaller organizations, to me, those are with just a modicum of communication skill, totally sufficient to get people and encourage people to draw on those inner resources, cultivate them, share them within their team or within their teams of teams, to let that new norm emerge in a way that is sanctioned from above, but essentially bottom up and spontaneous, built around the particular people in each team. Those sorts of sort of ground level preferences and variability that need to be contemplated and welcomed as part of a healthy organization, as opposed to an undesirable thing to be stamped out, which is often the case in that sort of repeatable, replaceable cog mindset that many of our organizations and schools are working to transcend and grow past.
You also shared in pre-work Stuart Kaufman's work that looks at biological systems and how they maintain diversity to enhance their adaptability. Could you explain this concept a little bit more, and how does it play out in our living organizations that have a modicum of self-organization?
Sure. Part of this depends upon how much you believe in evolution and the sort of Darwinian thesis. At the most basic level, none of our useful adaptations that we've gleaned as our species or the species that led up to ours, none of those things would have existed without something going a bit askew in the past. What I mean is, people were going along, and then there were these mutations. Most of them weren't useful, some of them were. The ones that persisted got us here. So that diversity, that occasional things going wrong, those things that come from outside, is the only thing that allows us to stay fit for purpose, fit for the current environment. And so, diversity is not just, I'm not talking about like the sort of political world of DEI and that sort of stuff. I'm talking more at sort of the level of variability. And without that variability, we lose our ability to change with the changing world. And I'll just take a very brief sidebar here to think about some of the megalomaniacs who seem to be running the world. One of the things that strikes me about them is, in general, they're very short-term thinking. Even more than that, for the people who think, oh, we've got to like get off of Earth somehow to survive the future, that's hundreds of millions of years away. I don't think there's a human yet who can really claim that they can influence speciation, but one of the best reasons not to live forever is that our species on this planet is certainly not going to be the one that is here in 50 million years. And I would welcome from the audience anyone who knows what the speciation parameters and forces are, because we have to continue to allow this diversity to allow ourselves to adapt, so that whatever the comes after sapiens sapiens can continue to remain able to deal with its current moment that we certainly cannot predict very well. End of tangent.
No, that's a wonderful tangent and a segue into the final theme that we promised to cover, which is modern times,
Yeah.
the implications of how we rehumanize the world before we become extinct or whatever, evolve
Yeah.
to the next, right? So that we've got these historical insights, these biological foundations
Yeah.
that lean to, we're really good at emergent collaboration, learning, and innovation if we just let ourselves. Before the show, again, we exchanged a bunch of ideas, and we were talking about agility and Big A Agile and the Agile Manifesto,
Mm.
and the values and principles. And based on my understanding and limited conversations with the folks, not a very diverse group, but they were, a factor of their time, the signatories, we spoke on this podcast with 14 of the 17, and none of them were thinking about anthropology or biology in the slightest. At least it was not explicit in their memory.
Hmm.
or the documentation of what happened in Snowbird
Hmm.
2001. They just wanted to get rid of the heavyweight processes and all the debt and the overhead that accumulated from that mechanistic industrial age. We were machines, and maybe they had that implicit intuitive understanding of human nature and biology. We didn't think to ask them.
Yeah,
Anyway, that elegant and deceptively simple summary of the values and principles that we point to gets at, in my reread last night, what the ancients seem to know in their bones.
totally.
Mutual learning through interaction, context over fixed process, adaptation over control, living systems over mechanical ones. Yet recently there's a return to the opposite.
Mm.
What strikes you about these patterns, either the good ones or the bad ones?
Yeah. Let's go back to the snowbird comment. That's really interesting because I think it's really important to not do what in the discipline of history is called presentism, which is to judge past people by our current standards. And I think that, my hat goes off to all of those signatories of the manifesto. Certainly, they weren't trying to do some of those things like anthropology, biology, because again, they were engineers. They were trying to build better software,
Yep.
pretty specific context for that work. And we know knowledge work, the bigger picture of how stuff goes now, software design is fully part of knowledge work, and the rules of knowledge work and the principles and all that have been elucidated in books upon books in the last 20 years. So I think in that way, the manifesto is a cool and useful thing, and I think will remain that way for a long time. However, like everything, it will become ossified if we don't let it sort of update and grow. And I think the Agile community in general has done a really admirable job in this. However, it has been stymied as it runs up against that very sort of deterministic, if A, then B, always and forever sort of stuff that really um, doesn't fly now in our hyper networked world. And I think, to your question about, application, where do we go from here, this sort of stuff, I think a lot of those big picture patterns really are just about the basics of being human together, of having some shared vision, some sort of shared purpose of we're trying to get somewhere together and we need all of us to get there. It's like that classic Ubuntu sort of thing. And given that there's a word from the continent from which humanity emerged, let's go with that and say, you know what? Actually, that right there tells us that the things that are most valuable to us are our collective survival, collective thriving. Because one of us thriving on its own is just insufficient to all of us getting to any better future.
Yes, but the quarterly earnings report is coming up, and organizations face a real pressure
They do.
to predictably deliver, quote, shareholder value at scale. Let's see if we can give a lens for leaders to
Mm.
help recognize when they're suppressing rather than enabling
Hmm.
what you and I are calling natural human collaboration.
Yeah.
What are some ways for them to go, oh, there's a signal over there?
For me, what I would really encourage leaders to do is to start with themselves and understanding themselves, by which I mean just start tracking your HRV, just one thing, and notice how it changes as stuff happens in your life. If you can notice yourself and learn to do that noticing, if you can learn to efficaciously intervene in, how your nervous system is doing and all these sort of things, which are not hard to do, that leader can then, if they're the kind of leader who really thinks about the team as much as themselves, propagate that understanding, that more humanistic view of the individual and those around them. And that would be the thing. Like start with something measurable. HRV is measurable. See how many minutes a week you're in fight or flight mode. How many minutes a week are you in something that's more balanced? What are the triggers? Like, can you correlate those observable states in your body to events outside your body to start to work backwards up the value chain to see, oh, are there ways we could do this thing better? I was in a coaching call yesterday with a woman who's a sort of upper mid-level manager who has recently started to make her work visible at the large organization that she is part of. And they had been doing some sort of grant work. Her boss came through and saw their work board and the lanes there for the first time. And she saw her name in the waiting for. She was like, "Oh, that's me. Oh, you needed me." And the boss saw all of this stuff without the woman I was coaching needing to say or point out anything. Those are the moments of magic that visible work and these sorts of things enable in real live organizations that are open to just open, period, open to learning, open to questioning, open to variability. So, how any one person might start first, I couldn't say because I don't know their particular context, but there are so many ways to get started that I would say choose one that's going to be the easiest to sustain and see what you can do.
Thank you for that. I'm looking at the clock. We're coming
Yeah.
up towards the end of our time box.
Yeah, yeah.
Not real easy to recap all the things we covered. I've got scribbled notes, but we've covered the history of how humans apparently naturally organized and learned together for tens of thousands of years before colonial industrial age practices kind of came in and disrupted things. A beautiful disaster is the organizational chart, which emerged out of a train wreck, right? But it's inefficient in today's world of complexity.
That's right. And that's, and if we go back far enough in time, that complexity science, the three-body problem, these things are relatively newish, and we just haven't gotten caught up. I'd love to talk about the three-body problem maybe on a future episode, because if you really want people to relax, managers in particular to relax, we can talk about in physics, there's this thing called the three-body problem, which then ties out to the challenge that most managers have of trying to manage three nonlinear things at once, which is any mathematician will tell you not possible. And so we waste a huge amount of time trying to predict the unpredictable, getting into the theater of reputation, all the stuff in companies that is just incredibly wasteful of people's energy and talents.
Thank you. That gives me a little bit of hope. It'll get me through my day.
I mean, I'm super hopeful, Andy. I got to tell you, I'm super hopeful because especially because we work with so many college age people in the lab, they give me hope. Young people absolutely give me hope. They're no more flawed than we were in the 70s and 80s. The context is different. Some of these things are not great. I'm not saying it's all roses and sunshine, but I'm very hopeful that young people are very grounded and practical in a lot of what they aspire to do. And that gives me incredible hope.
Awesome. As we wrap up, what are some of the best ways for listeners to get in touch with you to carry on the dialogue?
Oh, sure. The best thing to do is just reach out to the lab. So we can put the Leaf Lab link into the show notes. That's probably the best way. We love to talk to people inside of education, outside of education, really, anyone who's interested in the human project of learning. We'd love to hear from you, both to share show you our scars and bruises, show you our things that are, going really well. Because, we all have to get to that future together because we've got one atmosphere, we've got one planet. And so if you're an audience member who wants to pull some little bit of that into your organization, your school, whatever, we would love to chat with you.
Well, thank you, Simon Holzapfel, an apple.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andy Cleff.
Yes. Mine's a little easier. The original was Klepich, but it was shortened on Ellis Island in the 1910s. Again, the merging of different cultures into a common melting pot so that we were not them. I mean, even back then there was us and them, and that unfortunately carries on.
Yeah. I should say I'm also on LinkedIn, and I am not on any other social media than LinkedIn.
By choice?
By choice.
Interesting. I've recently started exploring Substack.
Oh, I'm sorry, Substack. I forgot that that's social media. It doesn't, in my head, it doesn't feel like social media, but yeah, I'm on Substack as well.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like a better title pool to go explore.
Way more. If you want to actually eat something that's not just emotional Twinkies and Twizzlers.
LinkedIn is changing a bit, and there's areas that are positive and negative, like any platform. Anyway, thank you to our listening audience. If you made it this far, you must have enjoyed the show. Share it with a colleague. Discuss it around the equivalent of your campfire. Also, give us a review, a rating, if you want to join the discussion. You can tell us we're crazy. You can share your ideas about experiments that you're using to try to create organizations that work with rather than against our salty water bag nature. Join the Agile Uprising Discord. See the show notes for a link. Until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast, signing out.